This is not a true story, but it could be yours, or mine, or anyone's. It begins with a girl named Eleanor. She wasn't the kind of girl people talked about, not because she did anything wrong, but because people didn't notice her at all. She wasn't pretty by the world standards. Her features didn't match what magazines praised, her clothes were plain, her voice was soft, and her presence was easy to overlook. Even she believed she was forgettable. She grew up carrying that invisible weight, one that no one talked about, but she always felt. At school, she was the last to be picked. At parties, she stood near the wall, pretending not to mind. In photos, she hid in the background. But she noticed everything. She saw how people listened more when others spoke. She saw how beauty opened doors, not just in romance, but in respect. And she silently wished, I just want someone to look at me the way they look at her. Her heart held quiet dreams, to be seen, to be chosen, to be enough. But reality was different. Once she overheard someone say, Eleanor, she's nice, but not exactly someone you'd want to show off. That sentence carved itself into her chest. She went home, sat in the dark, and stared at her reflection, not looking for beauty, but searching for value. Tears came, but not just because of what was said. They came because she'd started to believe it. But something happened that night. Not a miracle, not a transformation, just a decision. A quiet one, but powerful. She whispered to herself, I don't want to hate myself anymore. It wasn't a promise to become beautiful, it was a promise to become whole. She didn't throw away her insecurities overnight. Instead, she started small. She read a book on confidence, not because she believed it would fix her, but because she needed to believe something could change. She went for walks, even when her mind told her not to bother. She practiced smiling at herself in the mirror, not perfectly, but gently. People didn't notice right away, but she noticed. She felt a little more energy in the morning, a little more peace in the evening, and for the first time when she heard laughter in the hallway, she didn't immediately assume it was about her. She started learning how to dress in ways that made her feel comfortable, not invisible. She joined a writing group, even though her hands shook when she read her first story aloud. She dared to dream, not for attention, but for purpose, because she had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to be seen, not for her looks, but for her light. And that was just the beginning.
Time passed, and something strange began to happen. It wasn't that people started treating her differently, not right away, but Eleanor began treating herself differently. She no longer apologized for taking up space. She no longer shrank in conversations. She started looking people in the eye, not aggressively, just steadily, as if saying, I'm here too. She didn't become loud or overly confident, but there was something new in her presence, like a quiet steadiness that drew people in. One afternoon, after a community writing workshop, a man named Marcus, someone who had hardly noticed her before, walked up and said, That piece you read today, it stayed with me. You have a gift. She blinked, unsure how to respond. No one had ever used the word gift about her before. That night, she sat with her journal, staring at those words she'd written weeks ago. I don't want to hate myself anymore. She realized she didn't. Not completely, not yet, but something had softened, something had shifted. She used to look in the mirror and scan for flaws. Now she started noticing the curve of her smile when she was proud of herself, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about something she loved, the calm in her voice when she felt safe. This didn't mean she never felt insecure. Of course she did. There were still days when the past whispered cruel things in her ear, when she walked into a room and felt like the least interesting person there, when old memories returned like shadows. But now she had something those memories couldn't take away: self-respect. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet like a candle in the dark, but it burned steadily. She kept showing up for herself. Every morning she walked for half an hour, not to lose weight, though she did change physically, but to feel her own strength. She cooked more, she laughed more, she let herself rest without guilt. And slowly, very slowly, she began to glow. Not with perfection, but with presence. People noticed. A woman at her co-working space said, "There's something about you lately. You look peaceful." Eleanor smiled. She had never been called peaceful before. It felt better than beautiful. But she was becoming that too, not because her face had changed, but because her energy had. She stood taller, spoke clearer, moved with purpose. She no longer waited to be chosen. She was choosing herself.
It wasn't part of the plan to fall in love. In fact, Eleanor had quietly accepted that romantic love might not be for her. She had built a life filled with books, meaningful work, and a few close friends. She had made peace with herself, and that peace felt like enough. But life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. It started with a misunderstanding at a small neighborhood cafe. She was standing in line, reading a message on her phone, when a voice behind her gently said, "Excuse me, I think that's your bag on the floor." She turned and saw him. Tall, clean-cut, kind eyes, effortless posture. The kind of man she would have once assumed was far out of her league. "Thank you," she said quickly, tucking her bag under her arm. He smiled, not the polite kind, but warm and genuine. "You come here often?" A simple question, but the way he said it didn't feel like a pickup line. It felt like curiosity, respectful, present. They talked for a few minutes about coffee beans, of all things. And then he said, almost casually, "Would you like to sit together? No pressure, just I'd enjoy the company." Something inside her hesitated. Old voices tried to rise up again. Why would he want to sit with you? You're not his type. But those voices were quieter now. So she said yes. His name was Julian. He was a graphic designer who freelanced from different cafes around the city. He was sharp but unpretentious, charming but not performative, funny in a way that made her laugh from the belly, not the surface. And most unexpectedly of all, he listened, really listened. He asked about her writing, her favorite authors, the topics she cared about. He didn't interrupt. He didn't scan the room while she spoke. He looked into her eyes and stayed there. They met again a week later. Then again. One morning, after their third coffee together, he said, "You know, I almost didn't talk to you that first day." She raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "You looked so composed, confident. I wasn't sure you'd want to talk to someone like me." She laughed. She actually laughed. If only he knew the years she had spent hiding from attention, the tears, the journals, the long walks with heavy thoughts. But now, this was her. And it wasn't a mask. It was her becoming. They didn't fall in love overnight. There were awkward moments, doubts, and vulnerability. But it was real, and it was mutual. Julian never said, "You're beautiful," in the way others might have. He said things like, "You have the kind of presence that makes people slow down. When you speak, it feels like something matters. I feel calm around you." And that meant more, because this love wasn't about appearance. It was about alignment. It was about meeting someone at the same frequency, not to fix each other, but to witness each other. Eleanor, the girl who once felt invisible, was now deeply seen, and not just by someone else, but by herself. Even in the warmth of something new and beautiful, doubt can still whisper.
There was a morning when Eleanor stood in front of her mirror, brushing her hair, when an old thought returned. What if he changes his mind? She hadn't thought that way in a long time, but something about falling in love made her feel vulnerable again. She cared, and that meant she could be hurt. It wasn't Julian's fault. He had shown up for her again and again, with consistency, with care, with clarity. But inside her, there were still echoes of the past, moments when she had been overlooked, unchosen, or made to feel not enough. Healing isn't a straight line. She remembered something she'd once written in her journal. Sometimes we only realize how fragile we are when someone tries to hold us gently. And Julian held her gently. One afternoon, as they walked along the river, he noticed her silence and asked, "Where did you go just now?" She looked at him, unsure how to answer. "I went back to all the years I thought I didn't deserve this, that I wasn't the kind of woman men fall for." He didn't rush to reassure her. He didn't say, "That's not true." Instead, he said, "And now?" She smiled. "Now I'm learning to stay here, with you, with me." It was a fragile moment, but also a powerful one. She realized that the goal was never to erase the past, it was to build something stronger around it, to make peace with the chapters that once hurt and use them to write something better. Julian understood. He never tried to rescue her. He respected her journey. They began to build routines together, simple things. Morning walks with coffee, bookstore dates on Sundays, evenings where they cooked, danced barefoot in the kitchen, and laughed at nothing in particular. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic gestures, just presence. She once believed that being loved meant being flawless. Now she knew being loved means being real. She still had insecurities, moments where the mirror played tricks, where voices from the past tried to creep back in, but she no longer believed those voices automatically. She questioned them, challenged them, and often silenced them. Because her life was no longer built on proving her worth. It was built on living it. And love wasn't the destination. It was part of the journey. A beautiful part, but not the only one. She was still writing her story every day, not for anyone's approval, but because she finally believed she was worth the ink. The changes were no longer just internal. They had begun to show on the outside, too. Not in a glamorous magazine cover kind of way, but in the way she walked into a room, the calm in her expression, the steady, welcoming tone in her voice. People noticed. A former colleague from years ago saw her at a seminar and barely recognized her. He said, "You've changed. You look radiant." She smiled and replied, "Thank you. I feel that way too." It wasn't just about looks. It was the energy. She no longer sought permission to take up space. She contributed with confidence. She laughed without second-guessing how she sounded. She spoke in meetings and people leaned in, not out of politeness, but because her words carried weight. At a networking event, a young woman approached her and said, "I hope this doesn't sound strange, but you seem really comfortable in your own skin. I want to be like that one day." Eleanor's heart swelled, not out of pride, but out of deep recognition. She remembered being that woman, looking at others and thinking, how do they do it? How do they seem so sure of themselves? Now she knew. Confidence isn't born, it's built, brick by brick, kind word by kind word, hard day by hard day. And when it's real, it's quiet, Not loud, not flashy, just steady. There were moments she caught herself in the mirror and thought, I'm beautiful. And she meant it. Not in comparison to anyone else, not because someone told her so, but because she finally saw herself, not the flaws, not the failures, but the whole. The woman who had cried herself to sleep, who had walked alone, who had dared to grow little by little. Julian once told her, "You're the kind of beautiful that doesn't fade, the kind that makes people feel safe." She carried those words in her heart not because she needed validation, but because they reminded her of something she already knew. She had become the woman she once needed, and she had done it not by changing who she was, but by returning to who she had always been beneath the doubt. That was the real transformation. Not from ugly to pretty, not from invisible to seen, but from fear to love, from shame to truth. And as she stood in front of the mirror one morning, tying her hair back, she said aloud, "I'm proud of me." And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to whisper it. The wedding was small, not because they couldn't afford something bigger, but because they both believed in celebrating only with those who had truly seen their journey. The venue was a garden at the edge of town, quiet, full of blooming lavender and soft sunlight. There were no flashing lights, no extravagant decorations, just warmth and presence. Eleanor stood in front of a mirror in her simple ivory dress. No heavy makeup, no glittering jewels, only her. And she had never felt more complete. She remembered a younger version of herself, sitting alone on her bed, wishing she were someone else. That girl would have never believed this moment could be real. Not because of the man waiting at the altar, but because of the woman who now looked back in the mirror with steady eyes. She wasn't marrying Julian to be rescued. She wasn't marrying him to feel worthy. She was marrying him because she already knew her worth. Because she was ready, not for a fairy tale, but for a partnership. For love that saw her fully and chose her gently. As she walked down the aisle, she didn't worry about how she looked. She didn't search the crowd for approval. She walked slowly, peacefully, her heart open. Julian's eyes met hers. He looked calm, a little emotional, and completely in awe. Not just because of her appearance, but because of who she had become, and who she had always been. During the vows, he said, "You taught me what beauty really means. It's not perfection, it's courage, it's presence. It's the way you walk through the world with kindness even after everything. I didn't fall in love with how you looked. I fell in love with the way you see." And she replied, "I once believed I wasn't enough, but now I know I was never lacking. I only needed to return to myself. You didn't complete me. You saw me, and that made all the difference." They exchanged rings, they kissed, and in that moment, there was no trace of the girl who used to disappear into the background. She had become the center of her own life, not because someone gave her permission, but because she claimed it. Later that evening, as they danced under string lights, one of her old classmates came up and said, "I almost didn't recognize you. You look incredible." Eleanor smiled, not with pride, but with peace. She said softly, "This is what it looks like when someone loves themselves back to life." And it was true, because beauty, real beauty, isn't about admiration. It's about authenticity, about choosing yourself again and again, until the world finally catches up to what you've known all along. That you were always enough, just as you are, and especially as you become.